basics of capitalism. Like I said, to destroy our enemy, we must study it. So, can somebody read this out for me? Archers?
What is capitalism? Capitalism is the global mode of production today. It is based on the exploitation of the working class, the majority, by the capitalist ruling class, the minority. Capitalism not only leads to ever-increasing hardships for the working class, it always leads to crisis. It leaves the working class with the choice of suffering hunger and pain, or ending all exploitation and oppression through revolution.
So we're not going to get too much into like the historical development of capitalism today, but you know, like capitalism is a stage of civilization, basically, of like the humanity as a whole. You know, we've gone through like various levels of development in history. You know, there have been like feudalism, there have been like slave-based empires, and you know, this is like a tale of humanity's ability to like produce and take hold of our role in the world. And that's always involved like exploitation, a minority of the population controlling the surplus produced by a majority, and that the ability to control that economic aspect gives political power to that ruling class.
Case for every society, even pre-class societies, right? Hunter-gatherers still had to like reproduce the same conditions, right? They had to hunt and gather and build shelters, right? To continue to exist.
So this is an image of production going on in the modern day. So this is the automobile industry where the industrial working class is producing a certain commodity to satisfy a social need, transportation, whether that's through producing cars or through producing buses and trains and airplanes and whatnot. So the mode of production, and this is going to be a very important concept. Production in human societies has always been organized differently throughout history. So we talked about like feudalism, slavery, because I mentioned hunter-gatherers. So each different form of organization is a mode of production. And there's the three examples right there. So in every mode of production, there's three components. So the first is the means of production. And does anybody want to take a guess on what the means of production are? Sorry? Materials.
Property.
Technology. Factories, land, offices, basically everything that you need to produce. And then there's labor, more specifically labor power. So our ability to work, to add human labor to things, when we add that with the means of production, that is where you get production from. Humans physically operating the means of production. So together, the means of production and labor power are categorized as the forces of production, the forces that carry out production. And then the third category is the relations of production. And what the relations of production are like when you enter into the production process, social relationships begin to pop up between different people in society, on the basis of which large classes of people are formed. So we're going to go into these three concepts now. So this is a picture of Bangladeshi garment workers who are like the industrial proletariat in textile industries in Bangladesh. And we're going to do a little exercise right now. So
who here likes H&M?
I work there.
So this is where the shirts and stuff are coming from. So in this picture, what are the means of production? The sewing machines,
The material, the cloth.
materials, the cloth, the spools, all of that. Can anybody take a guess at what the relations of production here are?
I'm sorry.
Huh?
I was wondering what the labor be considered. Do you know how humans are also labor workers? We need them to make things like this to be happening.
Well, labor is one of the forces of production, but the means of production are the non-human elements that we're working with. So anybody want to take a guess at what the relations of production are?
The buyer and the seller, the maker and the buyer.
Wait, Archer had her hand up.
Is in regards to the consumer and the manufacturer for the consumer.
So in this picture, what relations of production can we see?
Those are the workers working for the higher ups to produce their means of goods.
I assume there are also foremen on the factory floor monitoring the workers.
Right. So, I mean, we just also answered the last question, the classes involved in production. So, you know, here we see the relations of production. The workers don't own the sewing machines, and therefore, when they're operating them, they're producing for it to be taken by another class and used for profit, the capitalist class. And, you know, these are the classes involved in the production process. You have the exploited workers, you have the manager making sure that production is going on behalf of the ruling class, and you know, you don't see the capitalists here, but the capitalists are somewhere else, you know, filling out paperwork and doing what they need to do to keep the process of production going on and keep profit being produced.
In fact, you see, like, they don't even need, the capitalist doesn't even need to be there. In fact, right, capitalism is developed at a stage high enough where, like, right, we talk like the Matrix and all that. It was not like exactly like that, but right, ideology works in such a way, right? You hire a managing class that is the agent of right, capitalism.
I would say even in this picture, you can even see how this like manager doesn't really seem to be doing much. He seems idle himself. That there's an even more idle class, but he's just like literally standing.
Facilitating the exploitation.
Yeah.
So, oops.
I just think that, like, for contextualization, to contextualize the exploitation and the working conditions, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Dhaka, Bangladesh, I believe last year, which killed 1,100 people, is just an example of, you know, the kind of, when we say exploitation, that's what we're talking about.
So, somebody read out the two definitions of class here. Go ahead, Rich.
Classes are forms of relationship to the means of production. Number two, in the epoch of capitalism, there are two major classes. The proletariat is the class that owns nothing, has to sell its labor in return for a wage in order to survive. Bourgeoisie is the class that holds political power and accumulates wealth created by the labor of the proletariat.
So, yeah, so there's like many other classes in the capitalist mode of production. You know, you still have like peasants engaging like agricultural production. You have like the petty bourgeoisie, like the middle class sort of. You have semi-proletarians, you know, people who like somewhat own small means production, you know, like streetcar vendors and whatnot. But the main two classes involved in driving the system are the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So here we have a picture of McDonald's workers striking for a union and a higher wage. So because proletarians own nothing but control over our labor power, which we must sell in exchange for a wage to survive. The wage allows us to buy commodities and services to reproduce our labor power, shelter, food, raising our children, and the capitalists will always try to get away with reducing the wage to increase their profits. And then I don't know if people have been seeing, there's been like intense class struggle going on lately, even in the US. Like you have like Walmart workers like occupying Walmarts and stuff like that. You know, Teamsters unions like holding more pickets and stuff like that. So, you know, wherever there is capitalism, there is class struggle. Wherever there is class, there is class struggle.
Then we should like see like the limits of it, of like within the political bounds of capitalism is that as workers ask for more wages, but they're still being exploited, right? They're just fighting for better terms of their exploitation, right? Which is you have unions, or you fight for like better wages, better benefits. And then when we talk about, I think Mari brought up, like about alternatives, it's talking about even moving away from just fighting for better terms of exploitation, but fighting for the means of production itself.
So political power. So in the epoch of capitalism, the bourgeoisie is the ruling class. It's the class which accumulates wealth and power by exploiting the labor of the proletariat. The state is an instrument that the bourgeoisie uses to control society and discipline the working class to keep it in its position of subservience and domination. So this is a picture from Occupy Wall Street when cops were like protecting a Chase Bank, as everybody can see, because that's their job at the end of the day, protect the institutions that drive capitalism. And when workers strike, the police are sent in to break the strike, and you have like the courts and the prisons all set up, not in our best interests. When oppressed communities resist, the police are sent in to put us back in our place. And even in our everyday lives, like stop and frisk and stuff like that. What is that? Deportations. What are these things meant to do? but to terrorize our communities in order to keep down the resistance from a social base that can actually carry out revolutionary struggle.
We should talk, right? It sounds really cold and all that, but it literally, I mean, that's what society is based off of, right? When we talk about, like, in more concrete, like, oppressed nationalities in the US, I say blacks and Latinos, like immigrant labor, or like historically African Americans, right, being oppressed in the US. When we talk about mass incarceration and deportations and all these things, it's literally like managing a little pool. Like they see the communities themselves as they're just there for work, and if not, then they're extra.
What do you do with the extras? Throw them in prison. So, somebody want to read that up?
The petty bourgeoisie is a class between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie are not the big owners of the means of production, but they have some capital and are able to hire labor as well as control their own amount of work. In NYC, the petty bourgeoisie is mostly composed of small store owners such as bodegas. This class drifts back and forth between siding with the proletariat and siding with the bourgeoisie.
So, the petty bourgeoisie is like, has an opportunity to join the bourgeoisie because of their position, but then for the most part, they're always being like, because of the contradictions of capitalism, always further and further being pushed into joining the proletariat. So that creates the potential to either win over large sections of the petty bourgeoisie, or at the same time, for the petty bourgeoisie to side with the bourgeoisie, which is, usually the social basis of like strong fascist movements. Like fascism, needs a popular base, and that popular base is amongst the petty bourgeoisie, which is an unstable class. We mentioned like bodega owners and whatnot here to give an example of the petty bourgeoisie, but can people think of other examples?
The home being a major site, sort of the original site of production and the reproduction of labor power. Homeowners are a great example of petty bourgeoisie.
When you say petty bourgeoisie, do you mean like upper middle class or middle class?
So for us, right, we always hear like in bourgeois economics, you hear like upper class, middle class, all these things. It comes by income, right?
Right.
You get like a number, but no, we don't necessarily go by that. We're going by like your qualitative relationship to production, right? So like a proletarian, like you're characterized by like you don't own anything, you sell labor power. Bourgeoisie, you own like large amounts of capital. Pure bourgeoisie, you might own a small amount of capital. You might have to work it yourself if you don't quality at a certain point. And on the one hand, on the other hand, petty, let's say bodega owners, they have a small amount of capital, they employ a few people, but because they're not monopoly owners, and in fact, a monopoly at this point in capitalism is very hard for small businesses to like even move up. And in fact, at this point in capitalism, like a 2008 financial crisis, we see how like many businesses get bought up and eaten up. Like who remembers Singular Wireless, right? They got eaten up by Nextel, right? Of AT&T, I forget, right? It doesn't matter. But we all know, right? You have these different phone companies that existed prior and then don't because they get eaten up. People get laid off, all these things, and then you become pushed down to the proletariat. So when we talk about like your income does indicate something, indicates like, let's say like how much wealth is being like brought in terms of like, oh, like you have skills, but they don't necessarily correspond exactly to the same thing, to bourgeois economics.
So why are we counting them as like an unstable populace that could choose between bourgeoisie and the proletariat?
Because capitalist contradictions, we're going to see later, right? Like competition is inevitable, and so centralization of means production is always going to happen.
In like 2014, when class consciousness is at like really an all-time low, how do we go about raising that consciousness level and raising that awareness of the way society is functioning, especially on a class level and on an exploitation level? Like, how do we as people here go about doing that?
Hi, how are you everyone? Percy, everybody knows. So I'm gonna do an exercise with you. Some of you might call it cheesy. I think it's a very good way to illustrate how capitalism works, how exploitative it is as a mode of production. I proudly call this a cookie exercise. It involves cookies. All right. So I'll need, I guess I'll need two people to be the people to be who like to work on their own.
I
I mean, like let's talk about this for a minute, okay? So like in these sort of work relationships, like we understand when we talk about capitalism and when we talk about class and social class, right? We don't think about it as, you know, people who has more or who has less, right? We talk about thought. It does determine, but it's not like what really determines your social class.
Your relationship to production.
Exactly. So in this case, like when we're talking about the owner of the means of production, who are we talking about?
The ones who own the
Yeah.
factory, the ones who own the machine,
Yeah.
the papers.
What are they called?
The bourgeoisie.
The bourgeoisie. Who are who are the people who are being exploited out of their labor and I'm still eating cookies.
The petty bourgeoisie.
No. The people who are being exploited out of their labor. What are they called? Yes. And then and the people who like are in the middle who don't necessarily get one cookie, but they get like 3 or 4. That's petty bourgeoisie. Okay. I mean,
so then we see like capitalist production, it produces three. To the combination, like he made more, there was more papers made than them, but then they're being exploited. You only get one cookie as opposed to them, even though it's not as productive, they're getting more because they're not part of the same, like the two opposing classes, right? It's not the only one existing, but it's how like production the most, it is the most.
I mean, like compared to me and Arthur and Danny, who produced more?
Yeah.
I did. Why?
Because you're putting out the means of the production and getting it back more or less.
Yeah, basically I'm like exploiting this very big pool of labor and I'm using it to my own benefit.
Hypothetically, if you sold all this back for way more cookies, which is like by the mouth, and they'll be like here.
So basically, class forms as a relationship to production, and we just saw that here. This group of people became the proletariat, they became the petty bourgeoisie, and Chrissy became the asshole. So, do people have any questions on the exercise or anything?
Distributing these raw materials that were going to be used in the production, but if we are able to have our own resources and share our own resources, then we don't need all of these different levels, in the process of, the production and the distribution and all this stuff, because all of us are sharing resources and also feel a sense of camaraderie by the fact that we are sharing the resources, because we now have something in common with each other, we have a shared experience.
Became class conscious.
Yeah.
And then overtake person, but then continue working, so we could all continue surviving, because we can't be a rapid change.
I mean, one of the conclusions that people sometimes get from this exercise, this is like the third time I do it, is that some people say, oh, then I'm gonna become like Archer or Danny, I'm gonna become petty bourgeoisie, so I can have more cookies at my disposal. But what happens, right? I mean, they're still getting outproduced by me, because I have a big pool of labor I can exploit, and I can, it's more efficient in that way. I can have more of this, more product coming out of my factory. Whereas then they're working by themselves or working small, smaller units. They cannot have as much product coming out of that, of that process.
Oh, one of the things I was thinking, because I was discussing this with Luis when we were on the way here. My thought, and I've said this many times, I kind of use this expression, creating circles of intimacy, okay? When you're talking about organizing, but there's an emotional connection. If a person is participating in a process and is collectively involved with the sharing of resources, it creates emotional connection and intimacy. The people who are like in your position or higher up, they are disconnected emotionally and psychologically, and some people would say spiritually, from the people involved. If you're already involved in the process, then you have an emotional, you have a connection because you're seeing these people and you're going through the struggle with them. But the moment that you're not going through the process and struggle with them, it's easier to exploit because you disconnected. You know what I'm saying?
To give an example, like I used to work at Radio Shack last year, and you know, like franchises like that, you have like small production teams. Like, you know, I would work very closely with my manager and whatnot, and you know, I was very close to her and whatnot. We were friends, we were all friends. But at the end of the day, it's like the relationship of production means that the manager is helping to facilitate my exploitation, right? So it's like, the question Khalil was bringing forward is like, which precedes the other? So here it's like the relationship of production is what is like determining like the level of emotional connection.
Yeah, well there's the structures that are built in place, but I'm just saying like, I just mean like an overall collective. Do you know what I mean? Like in terms of like, if the structures are, if the structures don't exist in place, yeah, okay, yes, you're right, there's true, there's certain organizations that do build teams, so there's like a bondedness, but it's almost kind of like you're bonding within a cage. Does that make sense? That's what you see. This is like, if this is all you ever see, then you feel bonded, but you don't know that there's more that you can participate in. Like in other words, there's a wider circles of connection. That's, you know what I'm talking about. It should be wider circles of connection.
All right, so 1, 2, 3, and then 4, and then we're gonna have to move on.
I think Chris makes a good point because I was actually reading this recently. It was about sociopathy and basically capitalism. Turns out like about 1% of the population in America is like sociopathic. And it also turns out that capitalism is a great breeding ground for sociopaths. So most of the people who are at the top do tend to have sociopathic tendencies. And sociopaths are the ones who can remain calm and collected, but they don't have they have like emotional detachment. It can be biological or environmental. I thought that was interesting.
Rena?
I think what's being talked about here is alienation and the specialization of labor. And I was wondering if we were going to go into that at all in this presentation.
We're not going to go too much into alienation, but basically to explain the concept really quickly, it's like alienation is like one of the early concepts that you get from like young Marx, where he talks about you know, the workers alienated from the product that they're producing because they don't own it, and that's like, you know, reflected like psychologically and spiritually in the worker, culturally. So it's like one of the concepts from the earlier Marx.
I also wanted to point out within the context of that exercise, the relationship of the petty bourgeoisie to the person with the cookies, essentially that, you know, their class positionality is still reified by who they're receiving the cookies from, and the fact that, you know, that whoever owns the factory can still close the factory, cash in on the insurance, and, you know, take out of their 401k, and the petty bourgeoisie is, you know, fucked like the rest of the proletariat. So that's kind of just an illustration of the way that like the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat still share a lot of class interests.
So I was also going to respond to Chris about her point because you definitely bring up a really good point, but then there's corporations such as the one I work at H&M. You know, these are corporations who sort of market themselves as being flat level organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my workplace, if I have a problem with the company, I can literally go to the person who owns the building and talk to the person. The head of HR at my building, she also told us a story about how one time she was unloading a truck, and literally the CEO who owns the entire corporation of H&M globally, he came in and unloaded that truck with them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, even in situations like this where they sort of collapse that emotional detachment, we still have to sort of understand that there's different relations to the means of production, and there's different relations of production going on. Like, i.e., even if we are working on the same project, I don't own the store. You know, even if we're working on the same project, I don't own the surplus value being produced on my shift.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I was thinking the other thing too, that I was thinking like on the level of empathy, because there's levels of empathy. So you can have emotional connection on the job, like what you're saying, and sometimes they say, oh, let's have a gym so that the workers can exercise. Let's have, a place where a nursery for their children. They do all kinds of things to motivate you, but I'm saying it's like freedom within a cage. And the whole point is, yes, circles of intimacy, but that intimacy also includes knowledge.
Right.
So if you have knowledge that, okay, I'm okay and I'm comfortable and happy at this company because we have these little circles of intimacy within the company, but if people are dying outside your door, then that's not, you know what I'm saying? You got to break the bars of the cage and expand the circles of intimacy. You have to have a world vision, to the sense that we are all a collective family, so to speak. We're a collective, we're all part of a universal collective. And then there's the individual groups within that,
So Monique, last
I'm just not gonna put this. So I think, with the circles of intimacy, that's interesting in the context of the working class within New York City and how New York City is comprised of as a whole. I felt very alienated and I don't know if that's the right word, but I just felt isolated within myself, and understanding from where I came from, also with being a part of a oppressed nationality group, being Filipino, I found a Filipino organization that I'm a part of. And I think that with circles of intimacy, I wouldn't say that we're overall a collective in a sense that I could find some collective unity within anyone, I guess. But I think that in the context of coming from an immigrant family, coming from like a working class family, from when my dad was a migrant worker, my mom was a migrant worker, and then understanding and seeing other people who have shared the same narratives within that context, and then also finding solidarity within other groups of oppressed nationality people, and understanding the conditions between like what's going on in their country in comparison to my country. I find unity in that sense. So I don't really understand what you mean by like overall universal collective unity, where I see kind of like a unity within being part of like oppressed nationality group, organization, or whatever, and kind of finding like understanding the relationship between class and working class, and like my relationship to myself here, and like overall like the production within New York City.
No, I mean it makes sense. I was just thinking
let's
like
leave this discussion for later.
All right.
Actually.
Sorry.
So for this part, since we're already like at 4:25, when we're like asking questions, comments, let's try and keep it like on both sides, like 2 minutes, like questions and answers. So terms here to look out for: commodities, use values, exchange value, the labor theory of value, surplus value, and money. So now we're going to get into the machine of capitalism. So,
oh my God,
Eric Moreno.
Commodities are the basic cell of capitalism. Human labor produces things that we need to use, and we acquire them from the market. Hair straighteners or bread at the supermarket or a book from Barnes & Nobles are all commodities. The wealth of capitalist societies is an abundance of commodities.
So each commodity is going to have two different kinds of values. So the first is a use value, and the second is an exchange value. The use value is really just the usefulness of the thing, and the exchange value is its worth in relation to other commodities. So a use value, let's take a length of rope, for example. What would the use value of rope be? Tie something up, exactly. You can put it into usefulness. But the exchange value of it is something that we can measure. So it's like 1 yard of rope equals 2 apples. So you can exchange it as such. So really the use value is like a qualitative usefulness of the thing, and the exchange value is its exchangeability quantitatively with other commodities. And a commodity is therefore a useful thing produced by human labor that's exchanged on the market. So that's actually a very important definition right there. It's a useful thing, it's a use value that's produced through human labor, a productive force, and is exchanged on the market because it has an exchange value. So Asha, can you read this?
Use values are the usefulness of a thing. Food can fill our stomachs, clothes can keep us warm, iron and steel can become machines, and pens allow us to write. Laptops and projectors can show presentations. Not all use values are commodities. Air and sunshine are useful and basic needs for human survival. However, they are not made by human labor. If food and vegetables are made with labor for consumption and not exchange, they are not commodities.
Yeah, so there's a big difference, right? Who cook? I cook. Who cooks? Yeah. So when you cook at home, you bought some stuff. It's different. But what are you doing? You're eating it, right? You're not gonna sell in the market. So who's people who cook? Who's worked with food, like at work? What's the difference? Who likes cooking at home? All right. So people who do that. Who, when you work on the job, do you like doing that? Necessarily no, right? Because you're cooking, but it's not for you. It's like exchange, right?
You're alienated from the product of your own labor. So exchange value. Mike?
Exchange value. A use value made by labor becomes a commodity when it is transferred to someone else through exchange. Commodities must be exchangeable for other products. This is the exchange value of a commodity. For example, the exchange value of 2 loaves of bread is 1 jar of peanut butter. The exchange value of 2 coats is 1 sheet. In order to qualify as a commodity, there must be something next.
But the important, what got cut off here is in order to qualify as a commodity, it has to be produced through human labor, as well as have an exchange value, because you can exchange it on the market. It becomes a part of capitalism, not necessarily for your own subsistence. So the next slide. So the commodity is the basic unit of capitalist production. Here we have the best commodity in the world, Krabby Patty. And here we see that each commodity has these 2 values. So what's the use value of a Krabby Patty? To be eaten. And its exchange value, you can trade 3 Krabby Patties for 1 Goofy Goober. So this is an important thing to understand also that Marx writes about. Under capitalism, labor power becomes a commodity. So first is a difference between labor and labor power. So labor is, the physical force, the workers themselves are labor, but labor power is their capacity to carry out, work, to carry out production. And when the capitalist, purchases, the worker for 8 hours a day, they're not necessarily buying the worker, they're buying the worker's labor power. So when we put ourselves out for hire, looking for jobs, what we're trading on the market is our labor power, our ability to perform labor.
For wages. And you can use that to live.
And commodification of labor power means you're disposable. That means your commodity controlled by the bourgeoisie. That's why Percy was able to say, oh, you're resisting, or you don't want to listen, okay, you're fired. Because you're under the control of the capitalist. Any questions on this part? Ezra?
I mean, the way that America, uses that you're under the power of capital is through majority of employment in the U.S. is not contracted. You don't have an actual work contract. And basically what that means without what's called the just cause, element of your contract, which basically says that there has to be a good reason for you to be fired. They have what's called at-will employment, which the majority of us who have jobs here are under, which is you could be fired for a good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all. I could say to Khalil, your shirt's gray, I don't like that shirt, get the fuck out of here. And technically that's legal.
That's not you have the Yankees on it.
Yeah. So that's how America would translate that.
Exactly.
You want to read?
You called on me before I raised my hand. The product is the property of the capitalist and not that of the laborer. Its immediate producers suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's labor power at its value, then the right to use that labor for a day belongs to him, just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse that he has hired for the day. To the purchaser of a commodity belongs its use, and the seller of labor power. By giving his labor does no more in reality than part with the use value that he has sold. From the instant he steps into the workshop, the use value of his labor power and therefore also its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. By the purchase of labor power, the capitalist incorporates labor as a living ferment with the lifeless constituents of the product. From his point of view, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodity purchase of labor power. But this consumption cannot be affected except by supply.
I have hunger and plague. The crisis or whenever there was insufficient production of food.
Overproduction. Marx showed how capitalists, in their desperate urge to earn more and more profits, went on madly increasing production. However, at the same time, every capitalist tried to maintain a higher rate of profit by cutting the wage rates of his workers and throwing them into poverty. The working class composes the largest section in society, and the poverty of the working class automatically means the reduction of their capacity to buy goods available in the market. Thus, on the one hand, the capitalist class goes on increasing the production of goods being supplied to the market, whereas on the other hand, it goes on to reducing the buying capacity of a large section of the buyers in the, what does that say over there? Very same market. This naturally leads to a severe contradiction between the expansion of production on one hand and the contraction of the market on the other hand. The result of this crisis of overproduction, where the market is flooded with unsold goods. I'm sorry, I'm blind. The other one is better. I'll turn it off.
So bourgeoisie will let food sit around or even destroy it if they cannot make a profit off of it. Everybody found it?
That's too dark.
Take
up the lights in the front.
No.
I'm going the wrong way, right?
No. Sam, that's too dark.
That's too dark. It's cool. But I can see it so perfect.
We had our own crisis.
Crisis of overproduction with capitalism, like the problem is literally that there's too much. The issue with capitalism isn't that there's not enough. There's enough there. There's like more than enough. You have the ability to produce, to feed everybody, to house everybody, and whatnot. But the relations of production and distribution don't allow everybody to have access to everything that's produced.
These are actual facts. Like, if you look at the rule is, the world produces twice as much food than it needs. 2 times as much, and there's people starving, right? There's houses, there's too many houses, right? There's probably more houses and like apartment places than there are homeless people. There's people who are homeless, right? Like these are contributions to capitalism.
One time I read an article about like how much would it literally cost to fix the world's problems, and it costs just about the same amount that it took to bail out the banks in Europe, which is $4 trillion. Probably less than that, because it takes $30 billion annually to stop world hunger.
But you don't think about
there are people who are getting that in return in taxes, which goes to show you how capitalism functions. People say that the system doesn't work. It works perfectly fine. The thing is that this is how the capitalist system functions. In order to change society, you have to change the system for itself.
Exactly, right? It's like about capitalism. When people say capitalism doesn't work, of course, capitalism works fine, which works for who, right? A liberal sees a homeless person and says the system's not working. A Marxist sees it and sees it how it's working just fine. But there's one thing though, it's not about when they say like, oh, it would take this much money to fix the world's problems. No, because like we said before, it's about the relations of production. What they say, they're trying to like obscure how it gets to that. Let's say what would have happened, that money they used to build the banks, if they would have fed people, what would have happened? Nothing, because then money became valueless. Like the self-actualization of money has to do with like how much capitalists believe in like their like self-expanding value. You know.
No, what I'm saying is with that.
I'm not saying I'm not saying you're not saying it.
No, I'm saying like that there are resources out there. It's just that the way the system functions is that it's about the control of resources, and that's why you need people to stay hungry.
Yeah.
So another example of overproduction, thousands of cars are just sitting around because they're unable to be sold, like miles and miles.
Just curious, are we gonna get into like war and overproduction, or just at some point that can be brought up? I was just curious.
We're not going to get into that today.
Okay, all right, because that's like, because you know,
We'll
that's
a conversation afterwards.
That's what I'm just saying. That's a serious big thing.
One thing that I was thinking about when you first quoted, like, for example, like fast food workers, that they, based on 1 hour of their labor, they can't even afford a meal at their at where they even work at.
Yeah.
Right? Or people who are producing like the iPads and iPhones in China can't afford an iPhone, right?
There's Brazilians farming your cocoa and sugar in Brazil, and they can't afford to get diaper. That's gonna be.
But there was some video that showed like this man who worked in like cocoa thing and never ate it before. Like after it was processed, because he was such at the bottom stage of production that he wasn't never able to taste the end until somebody actually was like, here, you want to taste what? And he was like, this is amazing. So
that's what was brought on the slides preceding this, right? That's the exact contradiction in capitalism. How, like, the person at the bottom creating what this thing is usually can't even afford it for the most part.
What you have, of course, and I think the slide prior to this one exactly, what you'll see is that Taft and Khalil brought up a good point about how capitalism functions. It's not about like making it sustainable or anything like that. It functions precisely for profit, right? So when you're thinking about things like this, this looks very familiar to certain people. Pictures like this, where let's say relief goods will literally be stored away, and like for quote unquote natural disasters, right? So for instance, if governments can't make a profit off of it, if a profit can't be made off of it, these relief goods will be stocked away in order to continue that dependency. So for instance, you would have parallels internationally and domestically, right? You would have parallels with what happened with Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, where literally so many of these relief goods are stocked away in warehouses and have actually gone bad, right? They've gone rotten. We're talking about food, we're talking about clothing and so on that has also been flooded. And they would be stocked away where, on the other hand, the Philippine government, the reactionary government of the Philippines, would be, instead of building houses and using these materials donated from around the world, they would be spending it on building military bases, because that's where they can find profit, right? Military spending. Similarly, after Katrina in the United States, like the response, we saw that the government's response, the reactionary government's response, was incredibly slow. But when it came during this period, right, this is mid-2000s, when it came to warfare, the spending was actually increased, right? The military spending was actually increased. So was the prison-industrial complex. Spending for the prison-industrial complex increased. So, like, it's a thing of, like, where are the profits?
Mm-hmm.
And the profits are certainly not where the people's needs are being met, right?
I mean, even in Louisiana after Katrina, like myself, Angie, and Khalil were there a couple of years back, spending a couple of weeks amongst the people, and they told us about how the disaster struck areas that were like mostly African American community, like bourgeoisie completely just overlooked them. But when it came to the French Quarter, the tourist spot where like people go for spring break, that they reinvested and fixed up really quickly.
Even like
Nourish, last one.
Also, this is something I guess a bit minor, but to sort of contextualize the petty bourgeoisie and exactly what Mike was talking about. I think a really good example of that would be to just watch like a singular episode of like all those Doomsday Preppers TV shows that Discovery has going. If you just were to look at one episode which centers on one family, these people will be storing up and preserving like foods that'll last them for like 10 plus years in an apocalypse scenario. And it sort of really begs the question that like this is a singular household, this is a singular family that has the capability to produce such immense amount of food, but are storing it for a disaster. You know, it sort of puts into question how much potential the petty bourgeoisie has to serve a community and why, and the multitude of reasons why they don't.
It just shows the individualism.
Individualism, yeah.
Versus proletarianism.
Exactly.
I'm reading a book right now about the revolution that went on in Nepal over the last decade, and how like in the base areas of the revolution, they were carrying out land reform, and instead of behaving in such a selfish petty bourgeois fashion, what different peasant families were like doing in those base areas, where they were like helping each other to develop their farmlands collectively in order to like erect larger agricultural communes that can begin to unleash the productive forces even more. So it's like for us as the proletariat, our values have to be like collectivism, embracing one another rather than just like me, it's all for myself.
So anarchy of production, right? When we talk about capitalism, we're talking about not anarchism in the left sense, we're talking about anarchism like it's not coordinated, right? So when we say, like, very good example like was brought up, right? We have food, like the military, so much effort, resources are going into developing military science and technology for imperialism and oppressing other countries and keeping other countries down, that other people are starving, right? It's like how much productive capacity. I read a statistic that like, I think like 60, like in the science, most of the sciences, they're gearing people up for like military, right, things, for like this political aspect of that, instead of getting people to, help, like developing like areas to drop food, right? Airplanes to drop food or whatever, right? But if you could think of marketing, how much people are just being employed to like try to sell you stuff, not even like a thing, but like actually just advertisement itself, how much money is going into that, right? Production is organized for profit overall, and it's a lot, it's ridiculous at the point where like people are, like you say people are starving, people are not getting what they need, but there's still, you have vast amounts of capability to make anything, like 3D printers and such, right?
So can somebody read this? Denise?
Anarchy of production. Production in a capitalist society occurs according to the needs of the bourgeoisie in their quest to accumulate surplus value. Therefore, development is uneven, and crises occur periodically. Different branches of industry, different sectors of the economy all develop out of sync because they are controlled by different sections of the bourgeoisie, each looking to maximize their own profits.
So like the financial bourgeoisie, you had the industrial bourgeoisie, you had the landlord bourgeoisie and whatnot, like these different sections of the ruling class. And because they're all in their own respective industries, like trying to maximize their own profit, the economic development like throughout the entire society is just uneven. That's why like some regions have like even if you look at maps of the U.S., it's like some regions that are like highly developed, have high living standards, and others experience like structural underdevelopment, very low living standards, and whatnot. Like even if you look at a map of New York City, for example, in terms of the demographics, it's uneven, right? You got like downtown Manhattan, where we are now, it's like the heart of finance capital in the world. But then you go out to the Bronx, you go out to Queens. What do you see? What do you see? What's different about the Bronx and Queens, for example, than downtown Manhattan? Really?
I think like even when we're here in like the heart of the financial like capital of the world, you even see like such a disparity. Like you'll see people in restaurants where like it's like $50 a plate, like minimum, and then right outside the restaurant is like somebody begging for change, and then like you see it as well in like our communities, maybe like in the Bronx and Queens you still see that, but I think you see it more here because like, people know that like the money is here, but then it's also like looking at the role of the state and like controlling everything and like private property in the state, like you have these people and then the state comes in with like a homeless outreach program with the police, and then like they lock these people up for like begging for this money, but then they don't go inside all of like the institutions that are actually keeping these people like on the street. So I think like New York is crazy.
What I'm trying to get at though is uneven development that's caused by the anarchy of production. You look at, like perhaps New York City is a bad example to use because it's just one city in the entire process of production in the U.S. But you look throughout like even the world, let's take that for example. It's like there's unevenly developed areas, there's more developed areas, depending on what country you're in and whatnot. But the basic point is that development will always be uneven, and it's not coordinated to meet the needs of the people around the world. It's just based on the law of value, the acquirability of surplus value.
So just to give a quick example, right? Let's say Ethiopia, like not even just like physically unevenness in the composition of capital, right? Ethiopia, never been colonized, right? They're like the only country to like not be colonized by Europeans, so they're very proud of that. But Ethiopia today, who knows, like you see like pictures like the starvation, famine in Ethiopia. Ethiopia produces a lot of shit. I mean, they produce a lot of food. You know what they produce? Coffee from Starbucks, right? That's like one of the main things they only produce. So it's like, it's uneven, right? Like their production process is solely built on coffee production because they want the expansion of profit, because world imperialism on a global scale designates certain countries to produce only certain things, right? And then for the consumption here, back in the home markets, and then there's still white people starving.
Sam?
I think, I don't know if it's because it just, what Melly said reminded me of it. When I was walking over here, I was really upset because I see these 3 white kids, they look kind of bourgeois, they have a very expensive camera, and they're photographing these 2 homeless people sleeping in the park. My instinctual reaction was in my head, which was slapping the camera out of his hand, because I think that is the ultimate form of disrespect. These people are already outcasted and the scum of society, right? And you have these people here who probably attended YU or new school, that are privileged in many respects, and they're here photographing these people who have nothing, who just have a sleeping bag and are out in the cold. Instead of like...
So exploiting them. Like they're probably gonna like...
Yeah, because they're probably gonna do a cute little article about, look at how stylish, homeless people in the street, when I bet they could pay rent for these homeless people, And it's just things like that it's insulting in society. I would never take pictures of a homeless person. If I have the money, I would pay their rent. Why would I want to see a person in the street suffering, And so I can make myself, so I can be a philanthropist.
What about when the state steps in and creates affordable housing or tries to, fund small businesses to create jobs in the community? You guys talk about how the state kind of tries to step in to resolve contradictions of production.
So like, yeah, we don't have any studies on that, but that's a very good point, right? The state, we talk about like the other studies in terms of imperialism and stuff. We talk about the state as an actor of production. The state isn't as what Marx would say, like the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, right? So people like to talk about, like Ezra brought it up earlier, like how people say, like, this is capitalist, but you have like a fucking post office and like you have public education, so that's socialism. It's like, no, that's ridiculous, right? What's really going on? If you remember the slides before, we talked about necessary labor, like surplus value being extracted, and you have the necessary labor time, and you're being paid for that wages. So on a societal scale, right, we can think about when the state invests in like health or like schools or like help small businesses or whatever. This is them being a little bit smarter and not being that selfish, but they're still being selfish, right? They're being a little bit smarter because they're trying to prolong, right, exploitation.
Preventing crisis, basically.
Preventing crisis, right? They're going to do these things so that way crisis does not happen, but it's still being moved. The tendency is still being pushed through there. They stay as active to like prolong that. Right.
Mike, last thing?
But at the same time, these things, these so-called public works, right? We all see this, and we all know that they actually serve capital.
Yeah.
So, for instance, what was the logic behind creating all these highways? Not only here in the U.S., but also in the U.S.'s semi-colonies around the world, like the Carolinas, the Marianas, and the Philippines, right? Why build like
produce them? We cannot even live without each other. So, the social character of production, but then, the value that's made out of that is being privately appropriated. So that is the fundamental source of all conflict in capitalist society, and it's reflected in the struggle between classes, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie to resolve this contradiction.
For us, it's like, right, it's discovery that, right, we're relating to each other with things, but all these relationships amongst things are really relationships amongst people. So for us is we can continue to create things while primarily knowing that the relationship is between people. And this is like thing like social versus private, right? Socialization is the labor process, private ownership of the means of production. Someone want to read?
Inevitability of competition. Monopoly produces competition. Competition produces monopoly. Monopolists are made from competition. Competitors become monopolists. If the monopolists restrict their mutual competition by means of partial associations, competition increases among the workers. And the more the masses of the proletarians grow as against the monopolists of one nation, the more desperate competition becomes between the monopolists of different nations. The synthesis is of such a character that monopoly can only maintain itself by continually entering into the struggle of competition.
So like when we talk about like world wars, world wars are inevitable in capitalism, right? Like, we can't really stop them because of this monopoly capitalism. The partial associations, right? Cartels, like we said before, like capitalists have their own associations and all that, monopolies and all that. These are also mitigated by the nation state, right? Because the companies are not just like, although they have very little allegiance to the nations, they still need the actual nation state, home markets to be able to like realize their value of one person abroad, and also the uneven development of society, and also different factors. But right, competition leads is like it's the ideology like continuous growth is the ideology of a cancer cell. So what happens when you have in the world like a few different poles that are trying to do the same thing, right? You have like the U.S., Western Europe, you have like China today, and then like the BRIC countries, right? They're all competing for the same thing. They have to come into conflict, right? In World War I, you had Europe divided, Germany, France, England, right? United States, they're all competing. You have divided up Africa, divided up Latin America, and informally whatever, but Asia. But they had to come into conflict. After they divided it up, in the next 30 years, they came into World War because they couldn't hold the contradiction.
I think that in capitalism, of course, there's always going to be a crisis because just the fact that a few people want to control the resources, and essentially they just want in those few people, there's that one person, there's each and every one of them wants to be that one person that controls everything and everyone, right? So with that being said, it's like you have people going hungry. You have people that don't have anything. It gets to a point where people have nothing to lose, and of course it's gonna hit a crisis because people are just gonna start going crazy and they're gonna stop caring. Well, this is my idea of what I'm getting from this. So,
but at the same time, it's not to say that it will automatically lead to revolution and the end of capitalism.
no, I'm not saying it's even gonna.
But that's like a common idea.
I think it's gonna.
I'm not saying it's you, but I'm saying it's a common idea even amongst the left. That capitalism will just collapse of itself. Actually, if anything, history has taught us that it's very adaptable. So, therefore, the duty is of the proletariat and the revolutionaries to actually organize to create the conditions for revolution and bring it down, rather than just wait for it to come crashing.
No,
I'm not saying
So I mean, I just have like two questions on like anarchy of production and inevitability of competition. So do you think that in the future there's going to be like an increasing like urbanization? Like
there's already increasing urbanization. Like Latin America, historically largely peasant society, is actually is mostly urban now. Like 60-70% of the people in Latin America live in cities now. But that 1950s, that was not the case, right? So urbanization, there's a rural proletariat, but the proletariat really thrives in urban areas, right? Because you're off the land, you're in an apartment, right, for the most part, and you're like just there. You're just there. All your time is able to like produce in a capitalist labor process. There was another question?
Oh no, that's good.
Oh, free trade. So we all talk about free trade and this, that, like how free trade is freedom, how free trade is so great, why is free trade so bad, right? So we all talk about, anybody knows about like the Opium Wars in China, between China and Britain, right? So like in the 1850s, like Britain literally fought wars with China. China tried to not trade with anybody. They tried to become very insular. China's fucking huge. They've been existing for thousands of years. They didn't really need Europeans. They had a lot of resources that Europeans wanted to exploit. what happened? They came and started a war for them to open the borders and trade, right? It's very political aspect, right? It's not just like, oh, just trade with me. Someone want to read out the slide?
You know what free trade will do for you, my little third world friend? Sign the agreement and you'll have the freedom to sell all your state-owned utilities to private U.S. companies.
Yeah.
So, do I keep reading the white guy's caption?
Yeah.
And that's not all. When your citizens object to free trade, you have the freedom to crush huge anti-free trade demonstrations in the streets. Plus, you'll have the freedom to watch labor and environmental rights disappear. Like they've been flushed down like, hey, where are you going? What have you got against freedom?
Right. So we're talking about in capitalism, right? The freedom here is freedom to exploit. Right? In Dominican Republic, right, they signed structural adjustment programs, right? Structural adjustment programs. What are they structurally adjusting? Well, the public utilities, right? Education. They'll loan these countries money on the basis that they dictate what they spend it on. And obviously, they're going to tell you not to spend it on education, health, these things. Spend it on making more roads, getting to the plantations, to the coastline, to the, right? These types of things that are going to facilitate exploitation on a better basis. So is this free trade? Oh yeah, we're coming into contact, but it's like, again, right, the same way the proletariat and the bourgeoisie come into contact, they're already unequal on a on a liberal political rights basis. Same way in the world, in economically, different countries, and free trade, they're already coming from unequal bases, and that's political, right, histories of imperialism and development. But, go back. Also, in Bangladesh, right, how, right, I mean, you can talk about the Bengali state, is like, it's managed by foreign imperialism, and they very repressive against the workers because, again, right, the United States, the imperialists, are only gonna like lend money to the ruling class in Bangladesh or whatever it is on the basis that they make sure that the workers don't organize, and then they have like, yeah, the monetary to do such things.
So why is it important to understand the crisis of capitalism? Richard?
Basically, for us revolutionaries, to basically understand it so we can effectively point out the contradictions of capitalism and cause these crises, and to basically help, I guess, point others in the light in a sense.
Because this is a permanently and institutionally flawed system that's created for economic crisis, and will be destroyed. And it's for us to help be aware of this crisis so we can help organize revolution against it. So help educate the masses so the understanding that this is economic crisis is a fundamental element of capitalism, and therefore we need to get out of that.
I think it's important to understand the crisis of capitalism so we could form a good understanding of what it means to be anti-capitalist, and like Richard said, pointing out the contradictions, right? So this shit doesn't work.
Also, like, it's just, like, historically, it's been shown like it's a lot easier to organize through fascism when there's a crisis of capitalism, which is going to restore capitalism, not going to.
Yeah. So, we already touched on correct aspects of it, right? So before Tafi talked about how the proletariat is both a class in itself and a class for itself. And then so when we talk about revolution, there's the objective and subjective conditions of revolution, right? Subjectively, this is the conditions of revolution. Learning the theoretical aspects of it, learning your class consciousness, on the one hand. On the other hand, right, Amilcar Cabral, Guinea-Bissau comrade, the very famous revolutionary, he has a famous quote that people don't just fight for ideas, they're fighting most of the time for like material things, right? So when we're talking about material things, right, crisis creates that when like revolutions happen. Not only are revolutionaries underground organizing for years usually, but preparing for the time when when crisis does hit, when there's no more bread, right? I mean, like in the Bolshevik Revolution, when the slogans was peace, land, and bread. They're in the middle of a war, there's still like feudal relations, and there's have this crisis, right? Peace, land, and bread, right? People didn't have these basic things, which they delivered. And the crises are going to bring about the objective contradictions, which it leads the social basis for revolution.
So, I mean, if most of this study is based on like the concepts from that, like political economy is based on the science laid down by Marx in Capital and the different volumes of Capital. So like there's various topics here that we covered, like what is a commodity, use values, exchange values, social relations between things, and whatnot. Class struggle being the fundamental end of it between capital and labor. But there's a lot of things we also didn't cover. But this study was meant to be like a way to like introduce people to Marxist political economy, so as to be able to understand like how to analyze capitalism scientifically. Basically, just give the tools to use it, right? Which we have to do every day in the work that we do as organizers, as revolutionaries. Like if we can't take the abstract concepts and use them to figure out how to apply them in our organizing, there's a problem. But there's a lot of different documents that people can use in order to, like there's a thing over here, a chapter from a textbook on political economy. There's another textbook called Fundamentals of Political Economy, also off of which the study was based, which we can provide links for to anybody. But there's a lot of like concepts to understand, and they all relate to each other. Like here's a diagram showing how like the commodity can be broken down into use values and exchange values, and the tension between that is determined by a socially necessary labor time value. And there's concrete labor and abstract labor, equivalent forms, relative forms, and so on and so on. The path of argument, the tensions between these things all lead at the end of the day to be reflected in the class struggle between capital and labor. So that's how the abstract becomes, the concrete political struggles that we're talking about. And then this is a concept that we didn't touch on yet. Base and superstructure is fundamentally important to understanding how not just capitalist society, but any society functions in general, human societies. So Marx uses this metaphor of the house, and he says, in society, the base of society is the relations. It's like the mode of production is the base of society. It's the relations of production and the means of production. And for capitalism, that's the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat, and the means of production are whatever you need to produce: land, factories, machines, and they're owned by the bourgeoisie. And then in the superstructure, you have things like education, family, politics, mass media, religion, all of that. And what the base does is that it shapes the superstructure, and the superstructure maintains and legitimizes the base. So to give an example of another type of society, hunter-gatherers, to use Cole's example from before. So with hunter-gatherers, what you have is in the base, very low-level development of the productive forces. So what happens when all you have are like stone tools and like bows and arrows? That means you're going out and hunting animals to eat, to feed the entire clan. That means you're actually not going to get a lot of food. So because of that, everybody in the clan has to be working together on an equal basis, and resources have to be distributed equally in order for the whole clan to survive. So there, the relation to production, the level of development, the productive forces, the base is determining the superstructure. Like the collective nature of the clan, collective life, and everything is determined by the fact that, in the base.
No one can live by themselves. There's no independence, and there's no, and also like you said, right, everyone's related to production the same way because the level of productive forces are not developed the same way. Everyone has to do the same thing, basically, for the most part.
Fast forward to the modern capitalist era, it's like, Mike talked about this before, I don't know where he went, but like, you go to school, what are you being taught to do?
It depends on what class system you're in.
Generally, what is school doing?
Disciplining you?
Uphold the sense.
And if you're poor, you're being taught to be
So
follow the rules.
It's reproducing the system, or in other words, maintains and legitimizes the base. What is the function of the family in capitalist society?
To uphold the values, essentially.
That's
to uphold the capital.
To individuate the site of the reproduction of labor power and concentrate the power at that site of exploitation in the hands of men at the expense of women.
So once again, maintaining and legitimizing the base. And the base is shaping the superstructure in the first place. So this is a model to use to understand how society functions. So, you know, like, we want to transform the economic base, but at the same time, you know, there has to be a revolutionary superstructure to go with the base. Because if you're like transforming, you know, the economic aspect of society after the revolution, but you're not transforming the way education is carried out, the way, you know, the family is structured, the way, you know, what kind of media is being put out there, the way politics is playing out, what's going to happen? You're laying the basis for the old ideas to help redevelop like the old ruling class to come back and take its power. So for us, like, you know, talking about transformation of the base, it's also equally important to talk about transformation of the superstructure through making revolution.
Sorry, why land in the base and not the superstructure?
Because it's a means of production. Yeah, it's like you use the land to produce agricultural yields.
This is a whole other study. We do a whole study on historical materialism and materialist dialectics, like the philosophy and science in different ways, not just the political economy, but there's one. We're going to touch on it.
So the last part, why study capitalism? Can somebody read this out? Melanie?
It is not just enough to say we are anti-capitalist. We must understand how it works in order to bring it down. Now that we have studied the laws of motion of capitalism, we better understand that all of society is built around the relationship between the class that controls the means of production and the classes that don't. We can articulate our struggles better with a scientific understanding of capitalism. RSCC's main campaign is to liberate CUNY for the people. Education is a part of the superstructure and takes on the function of reproducing the economic base. Schools reproduce two things, social classes and bourgeois ideology. CUNY is reproducing national oppression and capitalism. It is locking out working class oppressed nationality communities and trying to become a more prestigious institution that does not serve the working class.
So we talked about many times through this study, like, how do we struggle? How do we use these abstract theories in order to make revolution? Well, right here in CUNY, you know, in New York City, CUNY is a system that was set up in like the mid-1800s in order to serve the working class, in order to give the working class an opportunity to have higher education. However, the section of the working class that had access to CUNY for, you know, most of the last century and whatnot was the white working class in New York City. So, you know, as contradictions in the US developed, you had the civil rights movement, you had the black liberation movement and whatnot, contradictions in CUNY developed also. And, you know, black and Puerto Rican students were like struggling to open up the university for the people. And in 1969, due to a student strike, the bourgeoisie was forced to negotiate, and the bourgeoisie controls CUNY through the Board of Trustees, which is like finance capitalists and ex-FBI members sitting on it and whatnot. So, you know, in 1969, they were forced to negotiate an open admissions policy, which for the first time let, you know, oppressed communities have access to the university. And over the years, it became more and more majority people of color. So in 1976, they implement tuition for the first time in CUNY after it becomes majority people of color. And this is a university that's been free through 2 world wars and a Great Depression. So it's a racist attack on our communities. After that, they start taking away remedial classes, and over the last few decades and whatnot, like instituting like a 2-tier system between the senior colleges and the community colleges. And all of this is aimed at repealing open admissions effectively, and once again targeting our communities. You know, back in 1969, the communities that they were mostly targeting were like black and Puerto Rican communities. And it's a very different demographic composition now, but the relationship of oppression is there. So, you know, we look at CUNY as being an institution that's reproducing the base, a base that's marked by, you know, oppression of, you know, communities of color, of people from oppressed nations and working class communities. It's meant to reproduce capitalism and, you know, national oppression. So for us, the main campaign is liberate CUNY for the people in order to seize the university, like it was done before, like it's happened before. So there's no excuse to say that it can't happen again. For us, like, we want to seize the university, lead a struggle with the community to actually take control of the university, run it democratically, where we control the content of education. We're no longer learning like bourgeois ideology and white supremacist history, but actually teaching people about the liberation struggle, teaching people about, you know, the leaders that came from amongst our people and led liberation struggles, and not just learning about like Christopher Columbus and all that shit. Not just learning, you know, you go to business class and you're taught like bourgeois ideology, how to accumulate surplus value and all that. We want to turn the university into a base area for revolution, where we build a student movement that serves the people and builds up other movements in order to fight for liberation in the U.S.
And then there's also the populations, right? Like we want to change the ideas of education and populations of who's getting educated, right? CUNY is very unique in that it has a lot of working class people in it, and that's also changing because they're trying to, you know, like he said, they're trying to push out professionality and working class people out of it. Our job, changing the content of education and seizing the institution for political purposes, for who gets an education, right? Prisoners, right? There's many prisoners, like, and who are mostly Black and Latino in the United States, who are not getting education, right? Single mothers who, because they're locked out because of patriarchal relations in society, right? Not being able to get education and all these things, and higher education, bringing these people into the institution to be to gain revolutionary ideology.
So does anybody else want to add on or have questions, comments? No? This is the last slide. All right, so thank you everybody for coming to this study of RSCC.
We have a lot more.
We're trying to get out, like, you know, there's a difference between like small bodega owners in the Bronx and like doctors, you know, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Engineers, professionals.
I think also like the aristocrats, like the labor aristocrats, like that, are like non-profit owners, labor union reps that make all this money. It could also be considered like the petty bourgeoisie.
That is a good point, right? So like we said, like before, athletes, how they're like exploited, right? Like you're making millions of dollars, but these like you have like NBA, NFL, you have like these other guys making billions of dollars off of these pro athletes. But because of their relationship, like you said, with their, so I mean, it's a bit more complex when we talk about like how certain centers of labor get bought out in certain ways. There's also like a racist character to it because the U.S. is a white settler country. But yeah, because they have the perspective of even if their economic relationship is very, very much proletarian, they're getting wages. Their social status altogether, like collectively with other things, puts them in a position of to be petty bourgeois. Like NGOs, or like the people who run the NGOs, like people who run the unions.
So like I think a good example of like petty bourgeois, like in New York City, like that is pretty close to bodega owners, is like those people who like do moving. You know, like how there's certain oppressed nationalities that do moving, and they move things from here back to, you know, like DR, something express.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. They have Iscayanos Express.
Yeah, all that, right?
So that's a little bit different, right? So like there could be, like, let's say trucking here in the U.S., you're basically proletarian, you're not. But because of imperialism on a global scale, like let's say a peasant in like the Dominican Republic who has they're not poor. They come over here, they're gonna be proletarian, but because the relationship between the nations, you can like send money back and you have a different relationship.
So we know last thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a little bit because I want to return to I think home ownership, especially the place that home ownership takes in the American psyche, and especially the American drive. You know, we're kind of inculcated with this idea that home ownership is what we should aspire to. Going back to the home being a site of production, thinking about the home as a site of production, and contextualizing the petty bourgeoisie, for example, in the financial crisis and the crisis in homeownership that occurred at that time, which is what a lot of the bourgeois press was focused on at that time, is because capitalism has a natural tendency to, invite people to become part of this petty bourgeoisie, and that's what people are entering into when they try to own a home. But then the process naturally is that those assets, and again, this goes back to how we define class, not by income, but by real assets. there are a lot of people who are homeowners that are what's known as house poor, who all their investments are tied up in their homeowning assets. They have no, real income outside of that. So basically the way that the bourgeoisie kind of sucks all the value out of those mortgages and during the financial crisis, that's kind of, I feel like that's a really good illustration of the way that the petty bourgeoisie is formed within capitalism, but then is culled for the most part, and those assets are more and more centralized in these big banks that really, we learn, really own the rights to these houses.
Financing.
Yeah.
Also, the thing with home ownership is like, being a homeowner doesn't automatically make you petty bourgeois. Like, for example, you're a construction worker making a certain income, and you're able to use that to buy a home. But then, what is your relationship to production? It's like, you step on the work site, and you're a wage slave. Like, you are stuck to that site for 8 hours, 9 hours, whatever your shift is, and you are at the mercy of bourgeoisie. And that's the industrial proletariat that's really producing the commodities that make society move forward. Keeps the trains running, keeps the goods that we need producing, and builds our homes and whatnot. So it's like fundamentally, when we look at class relations, there's a whole web of things we need to look at, but it's always going to boil down to the relationship to production. So relation to production. In society, the producer's relation to the product, once the latter is finished, is an external one, and its return to the subject depends on his relations to other individuals. He does not come into possession of it directly, nor is its immediate appropriation his purpose when he produces in society. Distribution steps between the producers and the products, hence between production and consumption, to determine in accordance with social laws what the producer's share will be in the world of products. Now, does distribution stand at the side of and outside production as an autonomous sphere? Can I explain that?
So,
So, go ahead.
in the Chavez conception, distribution appears as a distribution of products, and hence as further removed from the quasi-independence of production. But before distribution can be the distribution of products, it is number one, the distribution of instruments of production, and number two, which is a further specification of the same relation, the distribution of the members of society among different kinds of production. To examine production while disregarding this internal distribution within its within it is obviously an empty abstraction, while conversely the distribution of products follows by itself from this distribution, which forms an original moment of production. Anybody know what this means? So he's talking about this Marx. He's talking about the relations of production, right? When we talk about the relations of production, right, we're all producing, but we're talking about class struggle. Relations of production can be boiled down as class struggle, political struggle. Why are some people proletarians? Why are some people bourgeoisie? Why are we doing certain kinds of work, right? Why are you getting, like Sandra said before, why come some people are paid this much amount versus this much amount? Then whatever, before the labor aristocracy. Why is there a labor aristocracy? Why is there a class that can relate as a proletariat, but yet they have a petty bourgeois outlook because they're getting so much income and being bought off, basically, right? So this is the political aspect of distribution, not only of, right, like, you can say economic distribution, but also political distribution of power among societies. Why are these things being distributed? And this is a political question. And this is precisely the relationship of production. The ruling classes, somewhat, and so when we talk about historical materialist understandings of view of society, how some of these things. So I guess let's go back. So Marxist genius comes back to how he looks at how the bourgeoisie and proletariat, they develop out of feudalism, and they come into contact into each other. So it's like, right, in bourgeois democracy, we talk about you have everyone's free, you have these liberal rights. It doesn't matter what your class is, right? Because in law, no one discriminates you according to class. Like there's no like before there used to be apartheid, like Jim Crow was apartheid in the U.S. Right? Like you're black, you're like formally this, but it was never the case. Bourgeois society ushers in an era where politically you can't be discriminated against class, right? But this still, of course, it doesn't matter because the position that people came out of, like let's say a peasant, like peasants that, let's say like for example peasants in Europe, right? Peasants that were able to like continued production, own means of production, and made it big, right, through the contradictions of the feudal system, and some didn't, right? A lot of peasants didn't. They were pushed down into proletariat. There were artisan workers. Some artisans were able to own their shops and then like expand capital because they kept trading, and like we'll talk about how that happened later. And others didn't. Others just, they had the skills to work, but they didn't own anything, and then they got pushed. So then, as this process happened over hundreds of years, you see like two forces: people who own, people who don't own, and they got pushed off the land too, right? Coming into conflict with each other, and they have, right, one has to sell the labor, one doesn't have, one owns all the means of production, so they have to make other people sell the labor.
So the relations of production, basically at the end of the day, is just your social relationship to production, and really determines everything else. So it's like, you know, if your relationship to production is you're in a position where you own nothing and you have to sell your labor power, then somebody else is determining, you know, the rate at which you're working, how many hours that you can stay at the workplace and stuff like that. It's really a lot of control over your own life, you know, while you're at the workplace. So we see the relations of production as being like a strongly determining element in shaping our lives. Let's even look at ourselves. It's like, what are we? We're students. So what is our relationship to production? We're in a transitional stage where we're being prepared, you know, like, for example, if you're a student going to like a CUNY school or like a community college, you're being prepared to join the working class or like a lower middle class. Versus if you're a student at like Yale or Harvard, you're being prepared to join the ruling class. Thank you.
And if you didn't go to any college, you're prepared to join the lower sections of the proletariat, right? You don't have fresh skills on these things.
So the class position of like us as like university students for the most part is petty bourgeois. Despite like the fact that, you know, like some come from more proletarian communities, some come from petty bourgeois communities, some come from bourgeois communities. It's like us as like a social group is a petty bourgeois group.
Somebody want to play this out? I'll be the capitalist. This machinery is very productive, and I own it. That's why I'm rich.
But you didn't build this machine.
And you don't go that. You don't seem to do any work around here at all.
But these are the relations of production right there. Right? Your boss is like, oh, they work so hard. There's a janitor not work really hard. There's like someone in the restaurant, like an immigrant, like undocumented immigrant in the restaurant, working really, they're not working really hard. So it's hard work really like where you're gonna get.
So the picture that you showed us before, he would more or less, that person would be the facilitator, he would be the one, I guess, who owns it. That person more or less is working, and I guess that person is, I guess, either built it or he's only was like an operator. So there's like an obvious like structure to what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, this is like, it'd be really great if all these people went against this person, but in fact, right, usually the person who built it, like, I'll talk to people who like, they're studying engineering, and he's like, oh, you study engineering? He's like, yeah. He's like, oh, I'm gonna tell the workers what to do, right? So even though he's not a capitalist, he has obviously that capitalist mindset, like, I'm gonna tell the workers what to do, even though he doesn't own it, he's an engineer, he has all the skills to live.
I have a question. So, there's this big psychological component, and maybe I'm skipping ahead in your slides, but the proletariat class collectively could overthrow very, very wealthy, because if nobody went to work and people stopped spending money, they're going to suffer. But then there's this need to keep up, and we see that in disenfranchised communities where money only goes out for people to acquire. And so I don't understand, and was wondering if you have some perspective on that.
So this is like we're looking at looking at the really economic aspects of it. Like we talk about like ideology as like a whole other thing altogether. Like I'm bringing bits of it in it because it obviously it's one thing, but it's one chunk at a time, I guess. But there's like a whole capitalist ideologies that come out of like we do historical materialist study. We talk about how like different ideologies come out of like these means of production. But yeah. But basically, we're laying out the economic foundation, like you said, right? The proletariat, because they're like directly opposed. Like, the bourgeoisie wouldn't be the bourgeoisie without the proletariat. So theoretically, yeah, the proletariat can be the bourgeoisie, and has done so in parts of history, in other historical times. and in relationship with other classes like petty bourgeoisie and intellectual students.
And Marx even writes about how there's the job of revolutionaries is to organize the proletariat and bring about a class consciousness, so that the proletariat becomes conscious of itself as a class and becomes conscious of its enemy. So there's two categories here. He talks about the proletariat as a class in itself, as in it exists as a class, and a class for itself, where it's existing as a class struggling for its interests.
Well, I was thinking, so I didn't bring anything up, that, towards the end, we're probably going to talk about how to manifest these things in practical ways, toward moving towards that process of the next shift. But the thing is, I do think that around the world, there's a shift in all kinds of paradigms, the way people perceive themselves as individuals versus being part of the collective. But I think this is the whole thing. If you're part of you're in a group setting, where you're working in a group setting, or you're a student, or whatever it is, but each person is an individual trying to struggle, trying to push their way, survival of the fittest, to get through and get the end result, and we win. We have this level. But the thing is, if you're part of a group, why is everybody just thinking of themselves as one little cog individual in the wheel? That's the thing. That's the perceptual thing. And I'm sure that we'll touch upon that later. But for me, the whole thing is, the key is knowledge. I'm interested in music, right? But the thing is, right now, as a matter of fact, I was involved with this guy who wanted to produce me, and he's going to share the royalties, this, that, and the other thing. So I decided I'm not going to sign a contract with this guy, because I feel like, I am not going to be, even though I have the knowledge, he would not want me to be on a higher level, working with him collectively to get the end result, even though I intuitively have the knowledge and can do all the things. But because I don't have the technical knowledge, he's not going to let me be called a producer. Technically, I have the intuition, and I have all of the instruments in my head, and I know exactly how I want everything placed. But if he were to say I'm co-producing or sharing in the production, that would lower his level and his percentage on it. So what I'm saying is, but if I had the knowledge of how to do certain things myself, that would put me in a higher position to be, to have more money, to do whatever. But I think that that's not the point. It's not having more power. It's having knowledge, and for people not to have the ego to be able to work with other people and to make a conscious effort to share whatever it is that they have as part of the collective. That's the whole thing. It's like an ego thing. It's an ego thing, and it's a fear-driven thing.
I think we shouldn't look at it so much like human nature, right? Because it's
well, I don't mean human nature, but I'm
not human nature, but it's true, right? People are really individualistic, but it's also why is that? What's kind of what are the values capitalism promotes, individualism, yourself, and all that. And then when you're expressing, you don't own the production. It's he owns all this production for music. So then even you have you're the labor, right? The talent. Those things have to come together.
Right.
You don't.
So the way we look at it also is relation to production, you change them, and that increases productivity. Like we just mentioned, if you change around the relation to production, where this person is not on top of you, telling you what to do and what not to exploit you, then the production of music becomes much better.
Right.
It's what are we taught? For most of our lives, we're in school for 10, 20 years, and what are we taught? We're constantly taught me, and not we.
Right.
Look at how we
Exactly.
take tests and do schoolwork. It's they call group work cheating. So it's this is so deeply ingrained into our minds that
Right.
working collectively is cheating.
Right.
It's banned outright. We're taught to strive for ourselves as individuals,
Right.
rather than understand that through collective action we make greater gains.
Right, exactly.